What's up, witches, and welcome to Salem, the weirdest place on earth. First off, if you're new, welcome. If you're an old timer, things sure have changed since the last video. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Now let's get witchy. In this video, I'm starting off what will likely be a very, very long series. In a textbook example of biting off way more than I can chew, I am endeavoring to examine all of the important players in the Salem Witch Trials. But why start easy? Let's instead look at possibly the least understood of the central figures in the Salem Witch Trials, Tituba or Tituba or Tituba. I've heard it a bunch of different ways. I'm gonna go with Tituba. Now, I'm sad to say that even in Salem, this particular person is often misrepresented or excluded from the conversation altogether. Now, there are some interesting reasons for this historical revision, and I'll definitely get into them, but let's start off by looking at what we know for certain about Tituba. Tituba is believed to have hailed originally from the West Indies, most likely Barbados. Now, right up front, you should notice a lot of ambiguity in what I just said. Let me just state here at the outset that there are tons of conflicting accounts about Tituba. I'll do my best to navigate them, but I might screw it up. Anyway, she sailed from Barbados to the continental US with Samuel Parris in 1680. Now, before that year, we don't really know much about her for certain, but I would very much recommend the book I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem for a narrativization of her history, role in the witch trials, and her elderly years. Oh, I should have added a spoiler alert there. Yes, Tituba survived the witch trials and was one of the few of the accused central players to do so, and certainly the only non-European. So how'd she pull that off? We'll get there. So in 1680, Tituba sails from Barbados to New England in the company of Salem Village's new minister, Samuel Parris, her owner. Now, it's likely that she came with her husband, who we know as John Indian. Both were slaves and both were under Parris's ownership by the time he arrived in Salem in 1689, 9 years after they sailed from Barbados. Tituba was ethnically perceived among the villagers in Salem as both African and Native American, or some mix of the two. She's consistently referred to in the historical documents and court records at the time by a variety of different ethnic identifiers. So she might have looked something like this, or more like this. We're not really sure. What the villagers did know of her was that English was clearly not her first language. She was married to John Indian, and she was very close to Samuel Parris's daughter, Betty, who was 9 years old at the time the hysteria began. Now, let me just nip something in the bud right here about the nature of magic and witchcraft in 1690s Salem, because it's going to be important to everything that's to come in this entire series. In media representations of the witch hysteria in things like The Crucible or the TV show Salem, Tituba is almost always presented as a sorceress figure who led the original accusers in dark rituals under the cover of midnight. Now, this is almost certainly exaggerated or entirely untrue. How do I know better than Arthur Miller? Well, it is true that Tituba was accused of such things on the record and even confessed to some of them, but even if such dancing and rituals did occur, they were likely far less sinister than we think, and crucially, not that uncommon of a practice for the villagers or children of Salem. Things that we would consider folk magic today, the villagers of Salem would think of as simple remedies. For instance, when you visit the Salem Witch House, you're going to learn that Edward Taylor, who was another New England minister who was alive at the same time as the witch trials, said, and I quote, "Human blood, drunk warm and new, is held good in the falling sickness. So them Puritans be drinking blood." Villagers would often do things that by today's standards seem pretty witchy. Talismans, ceremonies, healing techniques, the categories of things that were normal at the time but would seem pagan or even nefarious today is super long. So it's important to understand before we get into the hysteria and trials themselves that the distinction between what made one a witch and what didn't was different than today. Modern witches are distinguished from monotheists much more by their practices and beliefs than they were in 1692. So what did make one a witch at the time of the hysteria? It's simple, really. It's not what you did or what you claim to believe as much as it is who you did it for. That's right, our old pal Satan. Quite simply, a witch in 1692 Salem was one in the service of the devil. It didn't really matter what kind of person you were perceived as, it mattered what others believed about your intentions and in whose service you were thought to have lived. So, could you be a minister of God and be a witch? Yep. How about a church elder who's only ever done good for their community? Sure. Anyone, really. That's why the trials were so dangerous. They were grounded entirely in misperception, manipulation, and mass hysteria. And it was this perception of witchcraft that was central to the outbreak of accusations and ultimately the horrific traumas endured by hundreds of innocent people. But before all that, there was a slave named Tituba and a child named Betty Paris, and it was their relationship as well as the involvement of every single person in the Paris household that set off the firestorm of chaos and carnage known as the Salem Witch Trials. In the next episode, we will jump into how the hysteria actually began, what Tituba's role in it was, and how she navigated an enormously difficult situation and walked away from it all in the end. That's all for today, witches. Please subscribe to the channel for all things Salem, including the witch trials, attractions, reviews, and more. Hit that notification bell too while you're at it. Stay weird, witches. I'll see you next time.